You're ready to go.
Okay. I call the October 12, 2022 meeting of the Southborough Personnel Board to order. Welcome everyone, number of guests today. Nice to see. First order of business is approval of the minutes. Minutes were circulated in advance of the meeting. Any corrections, changes, amendments to the minutes? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Minutes are approved. Next document in your package is the expenditure ledger. As you see, we have still not spent any funds in fiscal year 2023. And we'll be talking later in the meeting about our budget for FY 2024. Okay, just a few items on the chair's report on tuition reimbursement. I'm happy to report the town has been repaid the $8,000 that we've given to an employee who left. So we have recouped that money. And secondly, just on tuition reimbursement, notice was sent out to the employees, I think on Monday, about applying for tuition reimbursement. So we're good to go there. Second thing I wanted to mention is you'll need to start thinking about language changes you'd like to see in the SAP, because we're going to have to be ready for the spring and town meetings. So to the extent you have any changes, obviously there'll be a number of changes, potentially a number of changes related to the handbook, which I'll get to in a minute, but any other language changes that you'd like to see in the SAP, please give that some thought. On the salary survey, you all saw the memo from Collins Center on the status. Mark and I have had a conversation with them, I guess, 3 weeks ago, maybe, and we raised a number of questions with them, and we had very much hoped that we'd have someone from the Collins Center here today. Unfortunately, the scheduling didn't work out. One of the items that they brought up was for us to be thinking about whether we wanted to maintain the classification schedules that we currently have, or to alter them in some way, one being to combine schedules A and C. So you'd have part-time, full-time, all would be in one schedule, which is common. Another possibility, and we really need to think about this, is moving to a step system, which is common in union contracts, and I'm informed the town used to have. But how you do that would take a lot of thought. So anyway, it's something that we would need to consider in detail with people from the Collins Center. So I'm confident they will be at the November meeting to discuss that and at least their preliminary findings. Okay, that's all I had.
Question on
Sure.
that. I'm looking at Mark and Brian now. That's going to have a budgetary impact, right? Like we spent a lot of time last meeting talking about 3%, 5%, 1%, right? That's nothing compared to what potentially is coming from Collins Center, especially just in the 2-page memo. When was their original deliverable date?
Well, you remember when we interviewed them, they were talking 2.5 months.
Right.
So
we're beyond
past that.
So
Yes.
I would encourage so that department heads can accurately do a budget, and they can start to get a read on where the budget's heading overall. Is I think if we can make it happen, like even if we have to do it on Zoom, that we should try to get a special meeting just for Collins Center, because you're asking some very loaded questions, right? They're asking of you, right? Some very loaded questions that aren't going to be resolved in one meeting. Just thinking through the budget cycle, we're going to hold up an entire budget because you're not going to pass on this for another fiscal year, right? Like you're going to effectuate some change based on what they're recommending. So I think we need to kind of move this along a little bit. So I would be at least willing to, sign up for another meeting if it meant Collins Center could come in, as soon as we could get it, coordinated and posted.
Anyone else?
I actually would agree with that.
Okay, I have no problem with that. And again, it was my expectation based on the last call that they would be here today. So it was a little disappointing. They had a scheduling issue. They couldn't do it, but
But it doesn't sound like they were ready for today.
No, not to make a presentation, a final presentation today, but to discuss the issues that I just talked about, how you want to set up, because they can't make recommendations on what the schedules will look like until we tell them what the format is that we want. So
I think we need to do that ASAP then.
I agree.
we'll be in touch with Collins Center. Anything else on that? Okay, moving on to item 5. Vanessa?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So there's a memo in your packet regarding 2 appointments that took place recently. The first one is Libby, who is our new full-time library assistant. She is taking the place of Amy Townsley, who we know has moved on from Southborough. In addition, we have a new call firefighter, Elliot, who has also joined the Southborough Fire Department. He falls under Schedule D. So that's the report for this month.
Any questions? Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Moving on to old business, revisions to section 11. Jason?
So I think Kate has a presentation she's going to pull up. So while Kate pulls that up, I just want to thank Dorian as well as the working group for their collaboration on this thus far. Realizing that we have basically 2 new personnel board members that have joined us since this process started. What I attempted to do was kind of summarize how this started, where we're at, and I think the items that we need to discuss moving forward. I kept the slides in such a fashion that only where it was very clear is there a recommendation. I do have views. I think the working group has views on other things, but I think the personnel board needs to weigh in overall, especially given we have 2 members that came in midstream through the process to this. And Dorian may add some things along the way. I didn't think it was appropriate to collaborate on a presentation outside of meeting. So Dorian just interrupt at any point in time that based on anything you've heard along the way. Maybe just to, Kate, you could just maybe put, I don't know how it's projecting to Zoom, but maybe we put it in
So it's big.
presentation mode. I mean, obviously it's fine, right?
Yeah. Good there.
Yeah, there you go, right there. Just press from the beginning. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you.
I'll just keep going. There we go.
Yep.
All right, you just go to the first slide. So this all started back in 2020. I actually was a member of the advisory committee at that point in time, and we were looking at various items and found some inconsistencies that were dealt with from a financial perspective. But it really, in looking at the actual SAP as written, and then obviously advisory had, access to union contracts as well, which are obviously public documents. We noticed a lot of inconsistencies in how things were being done, and just made a recommendation to the personnel board at the time to review it, right? There may be changes, there may not be changes, but just, obviously the personnel board controls the SAP, the select board control union contracts with the town administrator. This board took action on this starting in spring of 2022, given everything that was going on in between that. And we did a few things. Doreen and I got the comparable communities for Southborough at the time. I think we swapped one or two in or out at the time, and basically just said, are we on track or not compared to other SAP and other employee handbooks? And we also did an employee survey at the same time, which led to the formation of a working group, which consists of employees of all tenures like that would be impacted by any sort of changes within the SAP. That working group has met a few times over the spring and summer to develop potential frameworks of where we could go. Also, I think a lot of it was listening to concerns that they may have of any changes that we may go down. Remember, we're going to be talking about protected benefits in terms of vacation, and then we're going to be talking about benefits that are not protected in the same way in terms of sick as well. There's two different ways of thinking about that. So we did also coordinate with Labor Council along the way to just get guidance, because we know that she's seen transitions in other communities as well as this has gone along. So, Kate, if we can just go to the items reviewed. So we looked at a bunch of different categories, again, just to make sure they were still, quote unquote, fit for purpose. We looked at the accrual rate based on the employee's tenure. We looked at the amount of vacation that can carry over to the next year. We looked at the sick day accrual rate. We looked at the maximum amount of sick leave available to accrue. We looked at the sick leave payout at retirement or death that's in the SAP. And we looked at the number of personal days that are allowed in the SAP. On the next slide, you can look at language all day long, you can get opinions from employees, but with everything comes a financial cost. And actually, when I dug into the financial details, which for benefit of the working group members that are in the room, it actually has shifted some of my personal thinking, and I'll elaborate on some of that as we go. But this, I think, is a really interesting slide. So on the left-hand side, you have SAP employees, then you have other employees in the middle, which are primarily union employees outside of the schools, and some department heads that have contracts that do not follow the SAP. And that equals a total that ends up ultimately on the town's financial statements in terms of two liabilities, sick time and vacation time. If you look at the sick time, SAP employees make up a far greater liability, portion of the accrued liability than union employees. But then the inverse is true on the vacation side, right? You have the SAP employees make up a far lower liability related to their accrued vacation balance than some of our union employees. And if you look at all the union contracts, you can set them all day long. They're all different, and they're all different by reason, because each bargaining unit is bargaining to, right? They're giving something, getting something, et cetera, and they've evolved over time. All contracts and the SAP, I think the one thing I'll just continue to mention throughout this, have grandfathering clauses in them. So anytime there were changes as part of bargaining, anytime there were changes as a result of personnel board action from SAP, there's always been grandfathering clauses in there for employees hired before the date of the effective change. But I just, these numbers like really stood out to me, because you basically have two different things. You're basically saying on the sick leave time, the SAP employees clearly have something in the SAP that the unions don't have, and vice versa on the accrued vacation, right? There's different numbers of employees too, so it's not apples to oranges. There is, a greater liability there. I will also denote that the liability that you see on this page, when we started this on advisory 2 years ago, was a total of about 600,000. It's now, if you sum the 322 and the 488, it grows. So again, financials should not dictate where we go with this, but it is a component in terms of how we consider, in particular, the future. Again, keeping in context the grandfathering clause. So now I'm going to run through each of that bucketed list of what we did, what we looked at, and things we need input from the personnel board on to formulate a final version so that A, the working group can weigh in, but also B, so that we can have more of a open forum that's advertised with the impacted employees, just so that they understand the direction we're going and they can provide the appropriate feedback as well. So a few things. Our accrual rates are pretty much on par with our comparable communities based on longevity, tenure. Most of our recent hires have actually been granted 3 weeks of vacation, based on the clause I think everyone in the that's been here for a little bit is aware of, in terms of they can come to the department head or appointing authority can come to the personnel board and request 3 weeks to start based on prior experience. More often than not, our newer employees have been seeing that, but it's not 100%. And that's something that we should be discussing. So the question that I think is open for discussion in the framework that we've talked about with the working group is, should we just come up with a more uniform policy that, part of our practice should be about recruitment, but it also should be about retention of how do you retain employees going forward. So simplifying kind of how we grant vacation, in that anyone with 0 to 5 years of experience or tenure with the town, sorry, not experience, would get 3 weeks every year. These are all for assuming someone works a 40-hour week. It obviously gets prorated if someone's between the 19 and a half and 40. Someone that has 5 to 10 years of experience would go up to 4 weeks. Currently, they have 3 weeks unless they were part of this initial grant period where they started with 3 weeks. And then anyone with 10 plus years would go to 5 weeks. I think we all know that there are some employees in town that have 6 weeks based on clauses that existed approximately 20 years ago. We're not proposing to touch any of that. This would really be for existing employees that fall under what I'll call the standard chart right now in the SAP. So in this scenario, if we were to move forward with this, every employee would either be equal to or better off than they currently are now in terms of the amount of vacation that they would be granted on an annual basis. I'm not aware of any position that actually requires backfill in the SAP, that you're creating an overtime scenario for a department head. Of course, it does change productivity. It'd be 1 less week of working a year, but you could argue that the employee is also far more refreshed and focused on their duties during that. So that's something we should discuss, whether that framework, is where we want to go, or whether there's not consensus around that, but that is fundamental to where we go next. Next slide, Kate. The other thing that's directly tied to this is the amount of vacation you carry over to the next year. Right now, not to get confusing, but we use an anniversary year. So you can't look at the balances just on June 30th as a true picture of what's going on in town. I know that's what I did 2 slides ago because I had to pick a point in time that tied to a financial statement, but we use anniversary years. So some people tie beautifully right to July 1st because they were hired on July 1st. Most people don't. Some in November, December, July, right? All based on when that position was filled. But we allow a full year to be carried between anniversary years, which means that you have 3 weeks of vacation. You could actually have up to 6 on the books at any one time before there's any sort of reset provision. And remember, vacation is a protected benefit. So the only way an employee loses vacation is if they go 2 basically anniversary years, don't take their vacation, then they'll start to see kind of a loss of vacation based on what's in the SAP. This is I'll call it the larger observation we had. There was no community within our comparable of 20 plus communities that allows that much to be carried over. Most were 1 to 2 weeks. In speaking to a few, they have changed it over time, right? They have pulled it back a little bit, mainly to incentivize people to take it in the year they're earning it. Not necessarily from a financial perspective, but obviously vacation is meant for people to recharge, come back, and just be better at their job because they're not burnt out in any way, shape, or form. Interestingly enough, though, when you peel back the numbers, most employees don't have greater than their year's accrual on the books. there's about 5 that I counted, based on the data we had as of 6:30 that actually had a balance that's greater than their accrual. So if you think about it, right, is even though we have this, I'll call it, we're a little bit over here in terms of the generosity of this particular thing and just looking at it in the silo, most people actually aren't taking advantage of it, which is why the numbers were what they were on that first, on the financial slide, because people aren't carrying as much. They're carrying roughly around their accrual rate, was what I found, right? There are exceptions on both norms. Some people have like 2 hours in the bank, and some people are like way on their side. I'm trying to kind of get to the middle ground. So I think one of the things we need to discuss is instead of having an anniversary system, should we start to just front load at the beginning of the fiscal year and then cut back on terms of how much should be carried over between fiscal years? Again, get away from the anniversary year system, front load people and say, you have 3 weeks, here you go, use it throughout the year as you see fit, and then have some sort of carryover provision, because that was something that was very key to the working group, that like you can't always time it perfectly. Obviously, most of these departments have 1 to 2 employees, right? Some are larger, right? I think we heard different views candidly from the library because there just are different employees, different hours. Obviously, weekends are in play there too. But like, should we, cut it back in some way? Again, something that we need to discuss. The point here, and I haven't run numbers yet because I think I need to understand a general direction philosophically of like where we want to be before we run it's gonna be unfortunately on Brian and Kristen to help us a little bit, is you can't take something away, like from the vacation side, right? So even if we had a grandfathering clause, right? Remember, we're giving an additional benefit on the front end, right? You'd be giving 3, 4, 5 weeks. Most employees would want to take advantage of that, so they're not going to opt to grandfather, right? So if you're changing some of this, right? So we'd have to think through the mechanics of that, but it would come at some sort of pay, right? And that comes at a cost. We all know anything that hits the budget, is a cost, right? And is that a cost that's worthwhile to do, or is the current system fine and maybe we think of something prospectively? Again, there's this balance between grandfathering, which we have to do, in terms of making people whole, in terms of what they've earned already. There's also a fairness part of it in terms of people thought this is what they were going to always have. And the town has usually followed that, both with unions and the SAP. So I think this is the thornier part of like how you make this work, because there's a lot of different pieces to it. Gets a little easier until we get to sick leave pay. So then we looked at sick day accrual rate. There's not much to discuss here. We give employees about 15 days a year, and it's in line with comparable towns. The lowest I saw was 12. I just think we move on from this. I think we are right where we need to be on this. No one was higher than 15. So if you kind of try to put yourself in a perspective of trying to be at least at 75%, right, to attract and retain employees, there's just, in my opinion, nothing to see here. So that's why I've just asked for a confirmation when we get to kind of to debate and discussion on this, that you don't want us to look into this any further. But that one seemed to be the clearer of all of this. The next was the maximum amount of sick leave to accrue. As you can see, a personnel board in and around 2007 thought about this, right, and went from unlimited to 120 days, right? The magic of 120 days is that naturally when some sort of long-term disability plan could kick in. And so even if you've accrued this over a 20-year period, and unfortunately in year 21, you need to use it for some reason, you would be protected and have had this benefit that you've accrued over time and still be, collecting your paychecks. My understanding is the town does not offer any sort of short-term disability leave. Our policy in terms of the maximum amount of sick leave to accrue is roughly in line with comparable towns, but I'll be honest, this is a far wider range. Some are lower, some are higher, but we're like right in the middle of this. And the numbers seem to jive with, all right, how do you make sure someone isn't penalized if they're ever sick and is still going to bring home the paycheck that they're expecting, to pay the bills and obviously maintain their continuity of employment. So basically here, the same question is going to be confirmed. There's nothing else you want to see or hear before we just take no action on this particular piece of the policy. Next one is the payout. So current policy is 20% of anyone's sick leave that they've accrued over time gets paid out at retirement or death. So if they separate because they're going to go work in another town, nothing happens, right? So it's only at retirement or death at the time they're a South Borough town employee, do they get 20% of that balance. These numbers are large, right? Like you saw it on a couple of slides ago, there's no mistake in it. What that means is the employee's been showing up for work though, and they're longer tenured, right? So there is a balance there that I think needs to be struck in all of this. But what I'll tell you is most towns don't pay out for sick leave at all. I know a lot of us are in the private sector, there is no such thing. But in the towns that did have a payout, it was capped at a certain amount. And I'll tell you, those caps are much lower than what some people have on the books today. Again, going back to the grandfathering type clause, right? Like you can clearly see there's precedent for that. I think, what we need to decide is, do we want to cap payouts or remove payouts altogether? And consideration of how we balance that between new employees and existing employees. This is not a protected benefit. But just to be very clear, right? We've gotten advice from Labor Council. We can just pull this away tomorrow. I'm not advocating for that. Just everyone's on the same page. But there is a difference between how we approach this and how we approach vacation. And I just think my job is to present the options. I will tell you my personal view on this one, because I think just to kind of help drive some of the conversation based on studying it, listening to the employees, is you clearly grandfather everyone that's on the books today. You allow them to continue under whatever policy they're done. I do think there needs to be significant discussion about new employees. I don't know that new employees are looking at the sick leave payout and saying, I'm going to come, like, just generationally looking at how people approach jobs these days. I'm not sure that that's the benefit that's attracting in the town of Southborough. I'd much rather give them more vacation up front and do all those things. So I think, there is a balance we're striking here too. But again, open to discussion, open to a broader, group input here. And Kate, I'll just go to the last slide. This one, again, is one of the easier ones. We allow 3 personal days per fiscal year. It's very much in line with other towns. These are not subject to payout, so it's use it or lose it in any given year. I don't think there's anything else to look at here. And it seemed, right in line with what others were doing. So that's where we're at. I don't know, Mr. Chair, how you want to go back through and get opinions on where everyone's at in some of the issues, but that's where we're at.
Well, thank you, Jason, Dorian, and all the members of the working group that are here. You've clearly put in a lot of work. It will make our job. They're not always easy decisions that we're going to have to make, but the fact that you've done all the homework sort of makes our job somewhat easier. So I very much appreciate it. I know the whole board appreciates all the time you put into that. Why don't we go through? I know I have a number of questions, but I'll first turn it over to other members if they have questions about specific things, or I'm happy to start whatever. If anyone has something off the top of their head, or I can.
Why don't we go back to
Why don't we go back
the
to take
first slide?
I agree.
So Kate, let's go to vacation accrual rates, so slide 5.
Can I just ask one question on the financial snapshot on the sick leave liability? And maybe Brian
Mark.
can answer this. So the 181,887, is that only pertain to people who are eligible for retirement, so that they, in a sense, they're vested in that benefit, or is it all sick leave that people have accrued up to this point?
I can answer that for you.
Okay.
So where it came, this is the total of all employees.
Okay,
Of that 180, about 80 is fully vested. So those employees are eligible for retirement today.
Okay,
So the 180 though, you actually have to gross it up. So they've accrued
right,
180 divided by, the 20%, so this is the 20% number of all employees. So
Right.
for example, someone was hired in the last year and they've accrued 15 days, that's 15 days times their pay rate times 20% is in that number.
okay, but they wouldn't be in that number if they were just hired, right?
No, they are, because it's still liability of the town in the future.
But that's the point I'm making, that the fact that it's 181 doesn't mean that the town actually would have to pay out 181. Obviously, there's cost of living and all that, but because those people might leave in 2 years and not be eligible for anything.
They may leave, but it's a dynamic number, right? So unfortunately, you could have a death of a younger employee, so that would subject them, that's why they have to carry the liability from an accounting perspective, is it's still a liability of the town that grows, right? Now, if you have an employee that leaves tomorrow, that liability comes off the books. So that's why it's a
Right,
dynamic number.
at the end of the day, it doesn't matter in terms of the decision we make. I just
Right,
wanted
yeah.
to have a better understanding of that. Okay, I'm sorry.
So, Kate, I guess slide 5 is where I started asking a lot of questions of the person on board.
Was there a reason why we didn't have a standard uniform policy in place before? Was there some?
Well, go ahead.
But
Policy on, I'm sorry,
Well, one of the options, one of the discussion items is about a uniform policy. So I'm just asking more about understanding the problem we're trying to solve. And was there some drivers around why we didn't have a policy that was more uniform?
well, we do have a policy. What they're talking about is changing the policy and essentially increasing
Sure.
the amount of vacation
Sure,
that,
okay.
that people are entitled to.
and the reason I used uniform is, there's one verbiage in the SAP that allows the personnel board to grant 3 weeks of vacation to a new employee that has prior, I think it uses the word municipal
So there are
experience.
exceptions to. or-
Yeah.
Well, we changed it. It used to just say municipal.
Yeah, but like, you're right, so it said municipal, and then we started having a lot of great candidates come that didn't have municipal experience, but they brought experience that clearly, right, was comparable, if not better, right, in certain instances. So what, at least I have found in my limited time on the personnel board, is more often than not, we were just granting that, right? So you have, and it was subject to the appointing authority or the department head. So if the department head didn't bring it forward, there was no action by the personnel board.
I see.
If the appointing authority didn't bring it forward, right? So that's why I used the word uniform. So basically what it's saying is someone's experience when they get hired is, that'd be part of their pay rate, right? If Mr. Purple has the authority to hire up to midpoint, he can make a case, or the appointing authority can make the case to go higher. But from a vacation perspective, employees still work the same number,
Sure.
right? Unless they're,
So it's
yeah.
really subjective in some ways. If the department head would bring it forth, or, yeah.
Exactly, or the employee brought
The
it forward to the
employer brought it
department head
forward and we-
as part of their negotiation, right? So it was not uniform.
Great, thank you.
So go ahead, John.
In the existing SAP, there is a section on vacation and pay. And this new chart at the bottom here changes that somewhat. For instance, the 0 to 5 years under the existing plan was of the 2 weeks vacation.
Right.
It brings it up to date. Oh, proposes to bring it up to date.
So I'm certainly open to this, but to me, there are a number of questions that I need to be satisfied on. And let me start with the general proposition that I'm skeptical that giving everyone an extra week of vacation doesn't carry a cost, because I think it does. Unless you're saying we're so overstaffed that we can afford to do this and it doesn't have any impact. I mean, typically, vacation accounts for, seeing different numbers, but about 7% of total compensation is for vacation. So I think there is a cost to giving everyone an extra week's vacation. Second point I'd make is we have tried to be in line with comparable communities. And I mean, the data I've seen may be old, but every other comparable community, their accruals are pretty similar. And I think you said this, are in line with what we are currently doing. The third point I'd make is that while it's true that I'm not aware we've hired anyone, and Mark can correct me, with 2 weeks vacation in the time I've been on the personnel board, but I can say that every time Mark's come to us and said, we want to give this person 3 weeks and they meet the criteria, we've granted that. So I'm not sure there's a problem to solve.
I think there are employees that have been hired that are on 2 weeks still, based on our.
Okay, but that's what the market is then. Other towns are giving those people 2 weeks, and we don't need to give them 3 to hire them. But another point I would make is union contracts. All the union contracts have a schedule, I believe, that's pretty similar, not exactly the same as what we're doing. So we're then going to be, and I'd be pretty confident, having done union negotiations for a long time, that we do this in the town, when the union contracts are negotiated next time, they're going to be looking for that. And it may, I don't know how the union, how the police, fire, whatever operate, but, and whether they're hiring people at 2 weeks vacation, chief, I don't know if you are.
I would say that in general, our union contract has a robust vacation rate. That I think what was presented is comparable.
Yeah, you can't compare as much as we try to, right? And we put charts, like we're gonna get to, like, I don't want to deviate to the later discussion of where we're gonna have SAP increase, like where we included the union charts. Like, well, I've never been a union employee. I've been part of the inner workings, very similar to what you are. They're looking for specific things at certain points in time. They sometimes give on pay or vacation, or sometimes they get extra pay or vacation in absence of something else. That's not part of anything we would ever control as SAP. So I just think that's a negotiation item for Mr. Purple when he negotiates union contracts. We just finished 2, and I think we're ratifying another one tomorrow night. So that's 3 years down the road now at this point that any union contract would even come up. So I've done the math. I don't want to really divulge much more than that, but I would say I 100% agree with the chief's assessment. I think we're behind on the SAP compared to the unions, is where I'm going to leave it.
Well, but I think the union contracts, I think, are in line with what we currently do in the SAP.
But Barry, you got to look, like, I don't want to go much further on this, but you got to look at shift work and how things are defined in those contracts. Like a shift is very different than an 8-hour day for an employee that shows up and is predominantly at a desk or in the field. Like it is not comparable. I strongly encourage you, go read in particular the fire and police contracts and look at the definitions and help you with the math. This is very much getting this group in line with that, not necessarily going to create an issue 3 years down the road.
Okay, but to me, it's solving a problem that we don't have. We can talk about carryover, where I think there is an issue, but in terms of this, I think we're making a change that we don't need to make. And I think again, I'm not saying I'm closed-minded to this, but to me, it just seems like we're doing something that I'm not convinced that we need to do that does carry a cost to the town. That's just my.
So I have a couple of different points that may be, one, I'm not quite sure the benefit that we would have a continuing practice that seems a bit inconsistent. So if we're in a place where we're approving a number of exceptions, then we probably should think about how do we standardize and unify that approach, as opposed to you have people that are coming in, and if they don't have the right people advocating for them or know to come and sort of present this other option, they're at 2 weeks. And I think we also have to think about where are we recruiting people from and where are we losing people, and what are if we have data that support the prevalence of 3 weeks of this schedule. I just think we should think about. I think we have an opportunity. I don't know if we use different language about is there a problem to solve. I think we have an opportunity of thinking about how are we going to attract, how are we going to retain our employees. And I think that is separate from the way and approach that we would think about a union contract, because there are a number of different levers you pull as you negotiate those contracts that aren't part of this same experience that we're looking at now. So just something to think about.
On the first point, the SAP does say that on the recommendation of the hiring authority, they can use their prior experience to go into our table.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. I think that when we're thinking about transparency, as new people are thinking about this organization and being part of working here, it's a little easier to say, here's the schedule. And ensuring there's some equity and consistency in that, I think is an important part of having the transparency that we would like to have as we bring people into the organization. So I know there's a mechanism for changing the weeks that people can accrue. But is that the way that we want to proceed if we end up going through a process where there's an exception and we approve it anyway? I guess that's.
yeah, I guess the issue is suppose we have someone right out of college that we want to hire.
Yeah,
So under this, they get 3 weeks.
absolutely.
Under current policy, they get 2.
Because in my mind, we're looking at what is the worth and value of the role in the organization, not whether somebody was just fresh out of college, has 10 years of experience. When they're coming in, we're exchanging value for what they're bringing in, their expertise. So how they have that, like how they've amassed that, to me, doesn't make as much difference as opposed to, we know that when people are coming in this organization, we have some consistency and transparency in how we're doing that. So I think it's just I think this committee needs to think philosophically about sort of the way that we want to approach talent and the way that we want to, what that experience is going to be as we bring people in the organization.
No, that's fair. I think you run into, you hire someone with 5 years experience and we give them 3 weeks, and then you hire someone right from college with no
Sure.
experience.
Well, maybe then
And-
we look at what is a different schedule or it's newly.
I think you need to balance the fact that the
but there are
competing
people already
employer is
in
private
these
sector.
spaces.
Right, so if you're trying to attract someone that's trying to choose between a public, like starting a career in public sector,
That's
continuing
absolutely
a career or transitioning career, right? Leave where they're at, like, did they just graduate college or they've been in the workforce for 20 years? Private sector is starting with 3 weeks at least.
Okay, but you can't say we're not going to talk about union people because they're different, but we'll compare ourselves to the private sector.
But I'm trying to think about the type of employees we have in the SAP. That's all we can control. The employees that are most people that are going into police or fire are very different in terms of where, like, what type of career aspirations they have and what they're looking to accomplish. The reason I'm drawing a slight and just a data point to the private sector is most of the categories that are on our SAP, any one of those employees could go get a private sector job tomorrow in doing a role very similar in any organization, any industry. Fire and police, they only have one option, right? If they're going to stay in that industry, they're going to jump between towns, municipalities, or between state and local or federal, right? Like, they're not going to necessarily have that ability unless they're changing their career to go to the private. That's the difference I'm making here.
Okay, but the whole SAP and the way we do it is based on comparable communities. We don't compare compensation to the private sector. So why are we comparing vacation to the private sector?
Because remember the words I use, recruitment and retention.
But compensation is the same. How is compensation
Or not.
different for recruitment than
We're not,
vacation?
well, we're going to talk
I
about
think we're gonna
compensation
end up
once
in a
comes.
similar conversation
Yeah.
around that.
But I don't think we are, because the salary study is looking at comparable communities. It's not looking at the private sector.
I agree with you.
So right now, we have a mechanism, every year, we get to go and change the SAP, right? We're looking at data now that's over a year old. Like, we can go back and ask those communities, are they, right? Like, look at what Mark and his team have had to do to hire anyone in the last year. Like, poor Jay down at the end of the table is, right? Like, unfortunately, the poster child for how that all works, right? And what it took to get someone into that role. So I think, yes, we would be, if no other community has done this, no other community has changed anything, we would be on, I'll call it the cutting edge, the tipping point of that. But that, in my opinion, for this particular item, I have some opinions on other things than the other. Like, this is in my opinion, the easier way to go, because it accomplishes recruitment, it accomplishes retention. There is probably a cost, but I think it would be outweighed by the productivity on the back end and employee morale. And just think about any cost you have, replacement cost. How much time is lost training a new employee or recruiting a new employee? Like, how much time are our town officials spending trying to recruit people into these positions? And we're not paying headhunters in most cases like you would in the private sector, but it's still time that they're distracted from doing 10 other things that could be benefiting the community, but they're chasing resumes or trying to find the right fit or doing 5 rounds of interviews to people keep backing out because we don't have the right compensation package. And this is part of compensation package, so.
Go ahead, Joe.
Being a former town employee, whether it be here or elsewhere, I totally echo what you said, and I agree with it, that hiring nowadays is very, very competitive. Very competitive. And I don't think that changing from 2 weeks to 3 weeks, this chapter is up on the board. I think that is comparable to what's going on, whether it be the private sector or the town sector. It's I think it's something that should be done. Vacations are very, very important to people. The other thing I'll say when we get to the payout, at the end, is my firm belief that employees should be made to take a vacation that they've earned. It's important for them, for their well-being and everything else. You've got to get away. So when we get to that chart, I agree with what's there, but vacations are a big nut, and the more that we can be competitive in the hiring field, which is a tough nut right now, the better off we'll be. So I go along with this.
Did you want to, you moved to get,
I couldn't hear, no,
Okay.
yeah, I did want to make a comment, because I do appreciate the comments, and I wanted to get back to a comment that you had made, that I really think that this is a balance between liability that we incur for some of this time that's on the books versus the equity and the benefits that we offer our employees. Looking at hiring right now is so different than at any other time in my career. I've been doing this almost 30 years, and it's amazing that we're now seeing people in communities that are offering hiring bonuses for people who come. We have people who come into interviews, and they're doing us a favor by coming in to apply. you know, or we're, you know, and by just showing up for the interviews, we get ghosted a lot, you know, now. It's very difficult for us to, you know, to do these things. And I will say, you know, we don't always pay the most, but I think, you know, we are able to put together a more attractive package based on salary, benefits, quality of life. And I will acknowledge Ms. Hale. Sometimes I give her a very small bag of things to get something done with our preferred candidate, and she's always able to make it work. And I want to make sure that whatever we do at least continues to give us some level of flexibility to be able to go out and get the people that we need to make our organization better, more diverse, and stronger. And that's my piece. I do agree with some of the things up here. You know, I'm not sure that, you know, there should be, you know, a payout at the end of your time, you know, for sick leave and things like that. You know, I do think there should be some consideration, and we've done it before in the SAP. And I understand it creates some level of inequity, but if you were hired before this date, then these things apply to you. But moving forward, this is how we're going to be doing things. So people that are hired under those conditions retain the conditions they were hired under. I understand that things can change, you know, and just trying to have some, again, fairness and equity piece. So that's all I want to say.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Diane, go ahead.
So when we had met with the working group, we had discussed this vacation period. I'm of a very strong opinion that we should be going to 3 weeks. I also believe we should be front loading that. And my opinion on that is based on, we should be showing our employees how much they are appreciated. They are here. They've worked hard. They've worked through the pandemic. They've always shown up. And we are already giving most of the new employees 3 weeks when they start. We have very few people with 2 weeks based on what we've looked at. Very, very few. And if we're already giving 3 weeks, I don't see a problem with making it official in the SAP. So that's short and sweet.
All right, I think we probably exhausted that topic for a while. And you want to move on to
Carryover?
Yeah.
So this goes into what Dorian was just saying. I think there's two questions here, right? Is do we want to start front loading at the beginning of the year so that people, if they really want a winter vacation, they really want a summer vacation, they just know when they're getting it, how they'll have, you know, it'll be there. It's very similar to looking at some of the department heads have contracts in the room. It's very similar how theirs work. You know, I think if you went to this sort of system, you would need to think about the carryover, but this is how you deal with the carryover and create predictability for the employees. If we did want to go down this road, I will say I was very much in favor of that before I looked at the numbers. I could be swayed either way, and you know, at this point, because I do think most employees are taking vacation, and I think if we choose not to change it, my subtle suggestion would be those that we see accumulating vacation, that Mark or the department head or the appointing authority just have a discussion with the person, like, hey, you really should be taking time off, and make it less policy driven and more, you know, one-on-one sort of driven. If there are people that just aren't either able to take vacation because they feel like they can't because their job will suffer, or you know, there's other reasons, you know, there. So I personally don't have a strong view of where we go on this based on what I've seen with our current employees, but it is something we should discuss in line with kind of what we just talked about with, if we are going to change that chart and we do get to a consensus there, like should there be some change that goes part and parcel with that?
comments.
When we had someone talk to us, and this is my recall on this conversation, they had started working and they weren't able to take a vacation for a full year because they had to build it up. Whereas if we front load it,
Yeah.
that won't happen. They would be able to take a break before, or at least during that first year.
Yeah, and there's probationary periods too that we'd have to factor in that they can't
Like
take it
6
during
months,
the
right.
probationary period and stuff like that. But yeah, let's say you have a great employee that's hit it off in the first 6 months, like working 6 months straight, you know, is a long time.
Date people can have to take.
Yeah.
Right, so if we front loaded it, I mean, and there
It'd
was
be
a
there, yeah.
probationary period, say it's 6 months, they would be able to at least refresh themselves and continue. I just think I think it's healthier for the employees, so that's just
My experience, I've seen both. Part of the success of the front load is making sure managers can manage from a productivity standpoint and making sure managers feel comfortable and either, saying, yes, this vacation is fine, or listen, not right now. But we run into issues when we front load and managers don't feel they can manage the employee that wants to say, I'm gonna be off every Friday in the summer because I'm gonna be at the Cape, or whatever the case may be. And they don't feel comfortable or feel like they have the resources or the tools to have the right conversations to say, yeah, that's not gonna work for our operational needs. But I've seen it work both ways. I think if you front load, we probably should have something in place to make sure people do take their vacation. Maybe think about when they can start taking vacation as opposed to a whole year is a long time.
These SAP employees, how do they take these? Do they have to take them by the week, or can they take them individual days?
My understanding is they can take them in any increments
And you-
that's approved based on the policy of approval by the department head. So I'm not hearing a strong opinion on this one way or another.
I was asked again, and I think Barry does, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Like, what happened and why is this? Is this a issue, or
I think the
how
issue is,
prevalent is this as a concern?
I think the issue that originally came up was we are clearly out of line, right? Follow Barry's, thinking on the chart, right? Like there was no problem, and right, like just use your words, right, on the chart, right? Because it compares. Here, we are definitely, I'll call it, on the greater benefit end. But I think what we're also looking at is data that is supporting that even though there's a greater benefit, people aren't necessarily taking advantage of it, right? They are still taking vacation, which was candidly a pleasant surprise to me when I started looking, right? Like, and again, without going into individual employee details, like it made sense, like where some of the numbers were looking at anniversary dates. I do think the problem you're trying to solve here is, are you so far out of whack with other communities like that? Yes, our current employees seem to be all, within a relative average doing what we would expect to occur anyways. So I don't know that there's a huge problem now. Maybe it's something we monitor as we move forward, just to make sure it doesn't get further out of line. I do think if we choose to do that route, then I do think new employees, like we should consider whether there is we have this grandfathering concept that we've agreed to, like in past practice, but should we be thinking about maybe something for new employees? If we are offering this 3 weeks, which is, I'll call it cutting edge a little, right? Do you ratchet back what those individuals could carry going forward, which then leaves the existing employees in their same bucket. But I do think I would like to hear, like, if we choose not to do anything with this, do the current employees have a strong view on the front loading? Because I think, to be honest, we brought that forward as a potential, like, just like a negotiation, right? Like as a potential problem. But I don't know that it's as much of a problem as we once thought it was.
And has there been an issue or identified feedback for you can't take vacation for a year in terms of recruiting? Or
I'm not sure in recruiting. I think it's more, how, like, if you look at employees, like, are they getting the job done?
sure.
Are they ahead? And are they feeling like they can take it?
Okay.
Right. I think that's what I've heard is we naturally hire all high performers, top rated employees, right? So they naturally are putting their job before maybe their own personal life or their families. I think that's the problem that has been identified thus
Thank
far.
you.
I wonder whether by giving employees an extra week of vacation, you increase the possibility that there'll be more accrual, that there'll be more carryover.
Well, that's why it is tied to this a little bit, right? Because yeah, if you almost everyone would get an additional week. That's why I do think that if someone was going to opt into a new schedule, that you would want to consider at least ratcheting back what could be carried. You may stay with the anniversary system, but say going forward, a year or two out, we'd have to work through the language with Kate. You will only be able to carry 2 weeks forward as opposed to 4, 3 or 4 sort of thing. You could have a transitional period without, what I'll call it a one-time sort of payout, realizing that we're probably in a tough economic year.
Chief,
Under the current SAP, is it per the department head or manager's approval to carry over?
no,
Because I'm just wondering if that was a concern about changing carryover. If it's at the approval, then you may address some of the issues that you may have concerns about, like, I only have one employee, but if for some reason there's something happening in that year that makes it challenging, I could approve the carryover. It's just not automatic. And that may preserve the option to carry over in unique circumstances. But back to your point is, hey, the intent is that you've earned vacation time, you take that. But I would hate to pigeonhole where there's a circumstance where, like, okay, for some reason we couldn't change it. So I don't know if that's an option to put in the SAP, that it's at the department head manager approval for carryover. Back to Jason's point, if it's not an issue really that's happening. And I know in the union contract, that is not an issue. And right now, new employees or any employee wants to have time off.
So Chief, it's a good point. There's 2 provisions that I think are important. It says vacation shall be granted by department heads at their discretion, subject to the regular work needs of the department. An employee shall be permitted to carry over to the following years 1 year's worth of earned vacation. The employee must have the department head's approval to take any portion of a prior year's unused vacation in addition to the days earned in the current fiscal year. So they don't need approval to carry it over, but they need approval to use it in the following year. And then the other important part is there's a separate section right after. If in the opinion of the department head, there are unusual work-related circumstances that warrant it, a department may seek approval from the town administrator or his or her delegee to allow the employee to continue work and receive vacation pay in lieu of taking vacation, i.e. get an extra week's pay. In that example, approval granted in this section may not exceed 10 days per fiscal year.
Again, to my point, I think by having that in the data is not showing a lot of carryover, I think it resolves itself. And that managers, I believe in this community, would manage that to say, okay, you can't take time off or you can't carry over just because you saved them all up. But then it might be a circumstance where it may be balanced. Okay, thank you.
Mary, one item I'd like to point out is with the 1 to 2 week carryover, there doesn't seem to be any pushback from anyone on that. We just want it to be understood that if we don't have a provision such as that, when we get to the end of the front load year, we would have everyone making a mad race to the door to use vacation time, and that becomes problematic for departments. That 1 to 2 week buffer gives us, that safety net where people say, okay, I don't have to use it all up by June 30th, which is also the end of the fiscal year, which becomes a nightmare for us. So, I got a little time. So it's a nice transition from where we were in a full year at least.
Yes, and following what John said, every department is unique in their cyclical needs. So the fiscal year is great as far as tracking, but it may not always work for every department depending on when your high season is or when you need to be in the office. So like John said, you don't want to force everyone to rush into using before the next fiscal year. So I think that maybe the 2 weeks of carryover would completely ease that. And I think that would solve both problems.
thank you. Any other comments on that?
So I guess just so that we can round this out, because I think we need to start drafting language if we're going to change anything. are we letting it be? Do we want to explore language with Kate about limiting the amount of carryover? Are we exploring front loading because then it has a potential financial consequence? I just need a general direction of where we're headed on that.
I think the current policy is fine, except I'm not understanding this fiscal year versus the anniversary date. How was that, how do we align that with making it easier for the department head to put their budget out?
Well, the budget's the same. It's more, when is the employee going to be looking to use the vacation?
I don't know, but the fiscal year versus the anniversary date change their outlook.
Not in a non-union environment. Because I think they're budgeting for however many, like if you're an FTE employee, that's 2,000, just roughly 2,000 hours a year, right? At whatever their pay rate is, that they're getting that pay regardless of whether they take 2 weeks vacation, 4 weeks, 5 weeks of vacation. And then if they ended up leaving the town, any sort of payout actually doesn't even come out of the department's budget. It comes out of kind of the sick leave vacation bank that we fill every once in a while at town meeting. So I don't think it has any budgetary concern. It's more of a management of the department.
I guess, go ahead.
I'd like to see us explore the front loading. I would like to at least take a look at what it would cost, if anything,
Okay.
and what the impact is going to be. I think it's the right thing to do for the employees.
I have no problem with that. On the carryover, I guess my view might change depending on whether we went with the different schedule, the different vacation schedule, or stuck with the one we have. So,
So just, if we went with the 3-week starting point, am I summarizing, you would want to probably cut
I'd
back
wanna
the
cut back
carryover?
on carryover.
If we didn't go with that schedule, then you may be okay with where we're currently at? Okay, just, all right, so maybe we'll take the action item to work with Kate, just understand what that would look like in a 3-week scenario, 3, 4, 5-week scenario, and just how that would work and run all the math through and report back next time. And then we can make an educated decision as a board of whether we're gonna continue down that path or pull back. That work?
Yep.
Okay.
The only additional question I'm sorry, I had to take a break, but if we front load and someone say leaves within that year, we would pay out.
Now, I think what you would do is you would calculate the payout based on what they would have accrued as of that date.
Okay.
I think what you're gonna have
That's-
to, I think what you'd have to live with is, let's just say employee leaves in December, but they already took 2 weeks and they were only eligible for 3. They've already taken more. I just don't see, like, you have 2, 3, 4 employees of the year. Yeah, you may be out a few dollars there, but you're not really out the dollars. You're just not having, actually, you don't have a vacation payout in that instance.
Anything else?
All right, Kate. This slide, I just need confirmation. Anyone want to talk about sick leave accrual rate anymore?
No.
Okay. Sick leave to carry over. Any discussion on that?
No.
Okay, now for sick leave payout. I imagine there's discussion on this.
I mean, for me, this is the low hanging fruit, sort of that we grandfather current employees, and as they did in whatever it was, 2007, just say going forward, there's no payout. I mean, it's not something anybody looks at when they're considering taking a job or not. I don't think it has any impact from that. It seems we're just paying out money for no good reason. So that'd be my feeling on it.
Anyone feel differently on that one?
20%, that is 1/5 of a day's pay, or 1/5 of a day's pay.
Yeah, I mean, it's all, I mean, you're looking, because this is retirement, right? Like, thankfully, it's not usually due to death, right? you're looking at people that have worked in the town for 20, 30 years, right? So this is, right, like, it is a nice lump sum of money, especially for those that have stayed healthy and showed up to work every day. You know, we have seen 20, 30, 40, and 50K payouts recently, depending on certain, right? So it's not a small sum of money. Yeah. So versus vacation, like even if you are the highest paid employee in town, you're usually looking at somewhere in the 10, 12 range, right? Just to give some order of magnitude. So this is something that's compounding over the year. Again, I think we're fine on the grandfathering. It's more the employee that starts tomorrow that's going to be with the town of Southport for 30 years. This is something, you know, this is a longer term decision that none of us will probably be here for. But
So we're saying that whatever the employees are covered under now, the policy, they're grandfathered in when we can't change it, but we can.
well, we can. I don't think anyone's proposing
I
to
don't
do
think that we
that.
should, well, okay, I don't think that we should, but for new employees coming in, I don't think there should be a payout. That's what I think.
One of the big concerns that the managers had in the group was there almost needs to be some kind of incentive, or all of a sudden you're gonna have employees taking an extra 15 days off a year. Because they're like, oh, I've got 15 days. Like, why save it? I can't cash out at some point, so I'm gonna use it. And that becomes dangerous. So to Jason's point, when he made the presentation, perhaps putting a cap on it at a much lower level may be called for in this case. That way they're still incentivized not to use up time just because it's sitting there.
Okay, but why wouldn't an employee like that just say, okay, I was going to retire in June, I'll retire in April? Now,
Anything can happen, unfortunately, but this is throughout the years when we're working. Say someone just comes on this year. We get a year down the road and, you know, they've got 15 days sitting there.
But there are policies, right, that after a certain number of days of absence, they have to provide, like, right, there are policies
there
that
are.
imagine.
Yeah, but they can do a day a month. And there's nothing for that.
Yeah, but we can't cover a day a month. I mean,
No, but this would give some kind of safety net. And again, nothing at 20%. You set a dollar figure, maybe $5,000 upon retirement. And if you're looking at future cost of money from today, $5,000 is going to be nothing in 20 years. It'll be like the equivalent of maybe $500 to pay.
so just so I'm clear on what you're saying we change the benefit that currently exists for current,
No. Current employees be grandfathered.
okay,
And new employees coming in, they would still accumulate the same amount of sick time per year. But upon retirement, their cash out benefit, you could set a cap of like $5,000. And by saying $5,000 today, if you put that policy in, by the time anyone retires, that $5,000 isn't going to be worth anything. But from a hiring perspective, looking at it today, it does have a psychological impact to bring an employee in.
So,
go ahead.
go ahead.
I guess I'm missing why we're paying them anything.
So they don't use the time up as they go along.
But this is the way it works in the private sector. Nobody gets paid anything, and I'm not aware there's a huge problem with people taking time off. I mean, others.
I mean, do we have an abuse problem now where people are doing that we don't know of?
No, we don't know if that's the fact that there's a cash out at the end, so they're trying to accumulate their time. We don't know that. You wouldn't know until you change the policy.
I mean, it's a 30-year, it's roughly a 30-year cash out. If someone, I mean, making a decision today for something that may happen in 30 years, I will speak from my private sector side. I've had unlimited sick time since I was 22 years old, coming out of college. And I can tell you, I supervised many employees under that policy and never once dealt with hundreds of employees. I've never once dealt with a policy like issue where I had to go to human resources, an example. So I do think the payout, I don't think the payout's a motivating factor. I could be wrong, like, and I, welcome your opinion. I would like to talk to maybe some employees that just started, right? And see if that was really a motivating factor of why they took their job and whether that's changing their behavior. I mean, I'm fine if we do, we definitely need to cap it. I think everyone's in agreement with that. I mean, again, if we capped it at 3,000 to 5,000, which is what other towns are doing, I could live with that and move on, because I think that's candidly, I just don't, John, I gotta be honest, I don't agree with a payout at all, right? And I think that's what the board just has to, do.
I'm just looking as a safety net. You know,
I think,
for the operation.
I think if you have the right employees, this is not an issue.
Correct.
Right, the thing I have to point out though is in the professional world is a lot different than the hands-on world. I came from the private sector, was more hands-on. This was a problem. If people had sick time, they used sick time. You know, someone operating a machine, as opposed to someone sitting at a desk, they get tired. If they get a day they can take off, they're gonna take that day off. So I have to look at it from that perspective.
That's
You know,
fair.
I have employees that have a lot of hands-on stuff. Wouldn't be an issue that people have now, but I don't know what the future for my department will be. So I do like having that safety factor in there.
Okay,
All right, so it sounds like we're looking at, sorry.
So I guess, I want to make sure we're not making decisions that because we're trying to solve the issue with how we manage employees versus what we should do as a committee and sort of that responsibility. And so I think I've worked in both many sectors as well, so I understand the union environments, like things are different, right? And so I think, to me, that's something, if you have a absenteeism problem, then you manage that like a performance issue. But I don't know that this piece is what makes someone decide, and maybe talking with employees would make sense, new hires would decide to sort of take a job or not take a job. I think it's very robust and very rich. And I can't see how we would continue to have that payout, but
Jason.
you're on
I can say, and I'm not trying to go against the ties of my team members, because I'm strong advocates for what they're doing. My enticement was not this. I would say more the pension. I only got 2 weeks when I was hired. I did talk about 3 weeks, and I guess I didn't have that leverage at the time. Whereas 6 months past, people had that leverage to say, I want 3 weeks.
We're trying, Jay.
We're trying. So and that's, and I'm pushing for it. So I'm definitely an advocate for what, my team members are pushing for. This was not one of the things that was like, oh, I can't wait for this thing to happen so that I can take this money. A lot of the things that enticed me to even get into municipal working environment was the pension that I could potentially get at the end, and kind of that, and also you get a lot of the holidays that I would never get in the private sector. So, and also that work-life balance that the private sector in some sense doesn't necessarily say that they want to strongly advocate for it, but in some cases they don't necessarily get you to that point where you're able to take a vacation and feel comfortable that you're taking that day off. I'm not saying that I was able to take a lot of vacation time my first year here, everybody knows that, but now that I have somebody here to kind of relieve, some of that for me, I do have that sense where I can, do the things I need to do in my life and have that work-life balance. So that was not one of the top things in my mind when I came on board.
Anyone else?
All right, so we're going to either, obviously, everyone's in agreement with grandfathering existing employees hired before 7/1 of 23. So we may have a few more that fall into this bucket between now and town meeting. We are going to continue discussion on zero payout versus a cap. Right? Is that where we're at? That's the range of, and that will be only for new employees.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
This is only for retirement.
This is only retirement debt, right? So if Jay leaves tomorrow to go to another community, please don't. He gets nothing from a sick time perspective. All right, last one was personal days. I didn't see much of a reaction to that one, so. All right, I think we can move on for this, Barry. Thanks for the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. Obviously, again, you put in a lot of work, and I appreciate the input, and we have big decisions to make, but I think they'll be informed decisions. So much appreciated. Okay. Moving on to 5C, employee handbook update. So John and I had a couple of meetings with Vanessa on this, and we've been trying to get together with Labor Council because there are some things we're struggling with. One of the big ones is when council was here and we had the conversation, she was describing, and I would say, pushing for essentially getting the SAP down to what I describe as bare bones and taking as much as possible out of it. In our conversations in our group, and John can speak to this, but John made the point that doing that, and let's focus on the benefits piece, may cause some angst among employees because you've now taken the ability to change benefits away from town meeting and given it to this board. And I think that's a valid point. We've been trying to schedule a conversation with Kate to sort of get more input on her thoughts on that. If you don't take it out of the SAP and leave everything as is, subject to whatever changes we're going to make in the benefits, you then have to be very careful in the handbook in making sure the language and everything matches what's in the SAP. And then whenever you change something in the SAP, you make sure it's changed in the handbook. So again, as we started this process, I'll speak for myself, walking down the road that let's identify all those parts of the SAP that we can just take out. But John sort of opened my eyes to the other side of this. So I wanted to sort of throw it out to get people's thoughts on that. We don't necessarily have to make a final decision on that, but it's hard to move forward with drafting the handbook if we don't know if we don't know whether we're just taking things out and we can just write language, or whether we have to be careful about mirroring the language that's in the SAP. Thoughts?
So I would try to use the existing SAP as a baseline for anything, unless there's a reason that Kate can point to from a legal perspective that the language is dated, right? Like, I mean, she has been our labor counsel for a year, right? So some of that language may have been under good labor law advice 5 years ago that's now dated because of how just that world works, right? So I do think we should try to follow it. I do just want to reiterate the point of personnel board of 5 versus town meeting of 200 plus. That came up in our working group too, when we were specifically talking about section 11. I think we took one meeting and totally detoured on that particular topic. Look, I think there's pros and cons, right? Like ideally the moderator is appointing the right people to this board now and into the future. You know, they were very quick to reiterate, they had no concerns about the existing 5 members, but obviously any one of us term out at any one point in time, the moderator terms out every year and has that as their possibility. But I also do realize and want to sensitize the employees that the individuals that show up to town meeting are usually focused on one thing, which is the bottom line, and not necessarily about who's in their roles, because they expect you to do your job in the moment that they need you. And then they quickly forget sometimes all the great things you're doing in the background to enable you to do the job when you call 911 or you pick up the phone and you need an inspection or anything else, pay your tax or whatever you may need. And oh yeah, by the way, it's just a given that the buildings, John, are open every day, right? Like in functioning in any one way, shape, or form. So I do think there's a delicate balance. I don't have a perfect answer. I'm obviously clearly biased that this board is in a better position to carefully look at it, hold public meetings, make sure the employees know what's happening and effectuate change. But I do see that, like, you know, you could have the wrong 5-person board at any one point in time, and it could tip, you know, that, and town meeting is a good mechanism back. What I would suggest is that Kate come up, and this is where we left it with working group, by the way, Kate come up with a straw man of what she would strike from the SAP and what would actually be governed by personnel board versus what would be governed by town meeting. And maybe there's just certain components. Maybe the employees say, look, we'd really like the town to be voting with their cards on these pieces. But we think you, personnel board and town administrator as personnel director, are in a much better position to handle these things. But I think we also need to acknowledge most towns, at least from what Dorian and I reviewed, are doing this through policy, a personnel board, or candidly town administrator or town manager. And a lot of this stuff doesn't go to town meeting. So we are definitely on one side of the spectrum where every word has to get town meeting approval. I think we need to move away from that, but I do realize that there may be views on certain sections that they want a greater group weighing into.
And as I said, we've been trying to schedule a meeting with Kate for a couple of weeks, and she's tied up with, is Vanessa still here, but she's tied up and we may not be able to get her. She's now talking about our dealing with someone else. So, John, did you want to make a point on that?
My understanding of, when we started looking at possibilities of the handbook was that one of the objectives of it was that there are things that we'd like to change midterm, short of a time. I've been striving to try to find what are the things that we typically want to change today, tomorrow, versus waiting for the town meeting, so that we make sure that we're keeping in the SAP, which should be voted by the town, versus what we feel we need to change midship. We're working on that.
No, that's true. That's certainly one of the things that was a consideration in moving some things from the handbook. The other issue that we needed to talk to Kate about was, so we've seen the handbooks that other towns have, and we've seen the draft that she sort of put together. And it appears to us that most of the other towns have a different form of government. And by that, I mean they have a town manager rather than a town administrator. The issue we have here in the handbook and putting together the handbook is, while we have the greatest, I'll say, jurisdiction covering employees in town, our jurisdiction is very thin. It's basically compensation and benefits. The handbook covers a whole range of other things. And it's well and good that we adopt these policies and then even to get sign-offs, if you will, from the independent boards or whatever and say, okay, we're fine with this. But there are things like, and one of the things we've talked about, there's in the draft manual, there's grievance procedure. And you can argue yes or no, you want that. But if you want that, what are sort of the steps? Because at the end of the day, the last step can't always be Mark because he doesn't have jurisdiction over areas. Can't really be us because we don't have any jurisdiction over disciplinary issues, for example. So how do we sort of organize this in a way that makes sense and is workable? It's great that we have this big handbook, but if someone violates a policy and no one knows who's responsible for dealing with that. So I just throw that out. That's one of the issues we need to talk through with Kate about. Has she done this in a government structure that's similar to ours? And if so, how does that work?
Well, Barry, couldn't you just put a disclaimer in the book that personnel board covers these sections, town administrator covers these sections, police covers these sections, like
town administrator doesn't have jurisdiction over, someone who works for an independent board.
right, but we know what those answers are. Can't we just put a page in there? So if there's an issue, there's a disciplinary issue and there's a policy. the employee will be able to look, oh, okay, who covers this? Where do I go with this? Or where's the issue? And it'll be a breakdown there.
But
Or is
what's,
it not that clear cut?
what's the procedure? We're going to adopt in this manual, it's 100 pages or so. There's probably 50 pages of policies that don't currently exist in the town. They're good policies and the town should have them. Does the personnel board get to say, these are the policies for the whole town? I don't know how we can do that.
You can't.
So how did, that's,
So here's how I've seen it done is ultimate, like, because you've got bargaining units and you've got town administrator and you've got personnel board. I think there's usually a big clause unless governed by, like, in all the policies Dorian and I looked at to just get section 11, there's a huge bold clause unless covered with procedures from a collective bargaining, right? Because each collective bargaining contract has, right? Sometimes it starts with the chief, sometimes it goes right to town administrator, sometimes it goes to a board, right? Depending upon the nature of the grievance, right? But it should just say, this is the policy unless there's something enacted that trumps it, right? In terms of a fire collective bargaining agreement, a police collective bargaining agreement has their own provisions that are specific to the nature of the work. And then I think you capture the essence of what the town is looking to cover, because my guess is on certain one of these policies, there won't be a policy in the union contract, but it should apply to all, right? Like, I don't, I'll just do something simple, like a seatbelt policy when driving a town-owned vehicle, right? Like some, right, right? Like that's a lower line, right? I'm just trying to pick something that's a little, right? But like whatever policies the town has enacted likely apply, right? Like social mediators, right? Like who had, right? And then to the extent that, and I'm looking at the fire chief in the room because he's probably the only one that has, I'll call it different powers than most because of the strong chief provision. They can enact their own policies that may circumvent or supersede is probably the better word, town policy, but in most part, all town employees are going to be subject to it unless they work for the schools.
yeah, I'm not so much concerned about union employees, right? That's the easy one. The harder one are people who are outside Mark's jurisdiction, people who work for the town that are not under Mark.
Still the personnel director.
Like who, Barry? Give us an example.
I don't know, well, Mark works for the select board.
Yep.
There are employees who are not covered by the select board, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so what about those employees?
The town administrator should still, as the personnel director, have the ability to set.
Can he fire someone who doesn't work?
There should be a process. There should be a process outlined for this stuff. Of how
Okay.
it works, depending on who the appointing authority is.
Okay, but I mean, there are people who work for the town that you can't fire. Regular employees, not people covered
But
by,
I don't inherently have the authority, correct?
right.
Like, can we have an example? So we
Well,
can
Mark, give an example.
give us an example of
Planning
someone
board has
that you can't
employees.
fire.
Planning
Right,
board,
the town clerk.
town clerk.
Okay, but if there's an issue and the town assistant town clerk is written up, you are the personnel director, she's an employee of the town. Why would you not have the authority to do that?
If there's a personnel issue, even the departments that don't fall under the board of selectmen are gonna come to me to engage in a conversation about a solution. So, but can I inherently make the decision on my own? No.
So what's the policy to fire an employee? How many times do they have to be written up and put into their file?
It depends on what you do.
Okay, but there should be a written
Well,
policy.
And that's why there is in the new handbook. I don't know that one currently.
Progressive discipline is not a linear
No.
path. It depends on what you do. Did you make a mistake, in process,
Right.
did you run someone over with your car?
No, you're going to jail.
Okay,
You don't have to
so,
cover it.
do you get written warnings from both?
No, no,
right?
well, that's
Now, did
more
you-
of a,
So I know, I
I get it.
understand, but it all depends, it's situational and, Ms. Hale can opine on that as well. But like I said, so it's not clear cut. Every circumstance is different. If it's, if you have a random drug test issue, that's a whole nother separate issue under a whole separate, another separate set of regulations. So,
but as personnel director and they're employees of the town, why would you not have the final authority? I don't understand that.
I'm not the
Because
hiring,
that's,
I'm not the hiring authority. So select board is the hiring authority for most everything. The one guy who can do his own stuff, fire chief. he
Right.
left, Right, so he is the hiring authority. He does all personnel issues with regards to the fire department. When you hire the fire chief, it's really the last decision that you make in the fire department until you hire another chief.
Do you have those scenarios? Do you make recommendations based on? Do you make, I mean, you
Yes.
may not have the authority, but you certainly would make
Exactly, so
recommendations on
a
appropriate
department,
actions.
yeah, a department head will come to me and here's the issue, here's the situation, or to Ms. Hale, and we'll have the conversation. Let's talk about a path forward. How do we want to do this? Do you want to do a performance improvement plan? Do we need to start down the road of progressive discipline? What are the, absolutely. So in other words, if there are issues, so some people who don't have to use me for hiring, don't. Everybody uses me when something goes wrong. So I always get that end of it. I don't always get, that's a smile.
Do they, and I don't want to spend any more time because we're going to
Yeah.
talk to council about this, but do they do that because you're the person who has the expertise, experience in that, or do they do that because they know they're supposed to because you're the personnel director?
I'd like to think both.
I'd like to add one more caveat to that. I'd like to think both, and I think your expertise helps to understand what liability or risk might be created as they take action or consider different actions, and we want to make sure that we don't get into any legal.
And I'll take that one step further, is that if I was involved on the front end of some of those hiring processes that we don't need to be, we may be able to red flag issues, and Vanessa's shaking her head, that we may be able to red flag those issues on the front end so that we're not dealing with them on the back end when we more easily could have, there's a session that a consultant used to run. It says, not everybody belongs on a municipal bus. And that's why there's an emergency door in the back. Because people who do get on, you need to have a way to extricate yourself from those. But we need to be, make sure that we involve the right people in the hiring processes to avoid having to deal with those things on the back. It's easier at the front end than it is at the back end.
And again, this came up because we're dealing with the grievance procedure, which I think, Mark, you would like to have in there. But the way it was drafted said essentially that the last step was an appeal to the personnel director who would make the final decision. And some people raised the question, well, there may be entities within the town government who would not want to give Mark the authority to make that decision. So those are kinds of, again, I don't want to spend any more time on it. We're going to talk to Kate or
Kate's gonna be in a
someone.
good position to.
Yeah.
We can't be that unique in terms of our structure, right?
Yeah,
Like, I mean, again, we're not a town manager structure, but like other towns have elected town clerks
And
that can
again, just
appoint
to
their own
clarify,
employees.
town manager, town administrator is not the trigger point here. It's whether or not you have a charter.
Yeah,
The charter community, I was in a community as a town administrator with a charter with full hire fire, full personnel authority. So it depends on a charter and what it gives you. And here we have a town administrator bylaw that essentially is within the purview of town meeting, to change in terms of what, can do or can't do. So.
Okay. Unless anyone has anything more, we'll move on to revisit the FY24 annual increase. There's no new. Vanessa, I don't know that you have, was there updated?
Yep, there in the packet, there was an updated chart that starts with Bourne and ends with Yarmouth. to give the board, new data that other communities have contributed since you met last. We also put the other information back in the packet that Brian had helped us assemble last month regarding contracts at CPI, et cetera.
One point I wanted to make about these numbers from the towns, and it's a point that I should have realized, but frankly didn't, is that many of these towns may have step systems so that their employees are getting, numbers we're showing here are essentially just the cost of living increases they're getting on top of whatever increase they would get from moving up a step. So you do wonder when you see a lot of twos in this current environment that can't be the complete picture. So while these are helpful without having the full picture of what's going on in these towns, I don't think we can draw a lot from this. Well, first, let me open it up. If anyone has any thoughts in addition to what we talked about the last time we.
I think I continue to go back to what I said last time is without seeing where Collins Center is going to end up and what numbers they're presenting. Are they presenting FY23 type numbers, right? Or are they presenting what FY24 should look like, realizing that they're going to recommend changes in the charts, like it is clearly seems. And then the loaded question earlier about steps, right? Like when I was looking at like the fire and police, right? Actually, just police, right? Right, they have 7 or 8 steps, right? So some people are seeing 7-8% increases every year because they're getting a COLA, and then they're getting, because they're just 1 more year tenured. Like we got to land that plane before we can, I'm so fine if department heads want to use 3% for what Brian needs to start from a budgetary process, but like this needs to be looked at holistically, and just sticking my thumb in the air, like I'm not going to vote on an increase until we land with Collins.
Anyone else? Okay.
We're gonna try to get a meeting with Collins before
Yeah.
the next meeting, right? So we should.
Yeah. Well, we may need to do it before the next meeting, so before the next scheduled meeting. Let me put it that way.
Right, like in 2 weeks
Yeah.
or tomorrow.
Not tomorrow. Okay, we will put this off until then. Last piece of business is our own budget. You have a document in your file. Just looking at this, you remember that the employee development number was increased at the request of the select board from, we had 3,000 in our budget. They asked us to put an additional 4 in, which we did for this fiscal year. To date, none of that has been spent. I have at various meetings I've had with managers and others asked for suggestions on what they'd like to see, and to date haven't received anything. And I think most of you know there are other training opportunities for employees and managers through our insurance carrier and others through the state organization that we can get without having to expend funds. So I believe I know people are taking advantage of those opportunities. So I don't want to suggest there's no employee development going on. But let's start at the top. Tuition reimbursement, we've used the $5,000 figure for a few years. We haven't spent $5,000 in several years. Obviously, we just return the money to the town if we don't use it. What are people's thoughts on 5,000?
Keep it and hope people start using it.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, The management consulting this year, obviously, we're going to spend the 5 on the Collins Center. For fiscal year 24, I don't expect to have any significant consulting charges, but we also do use labor council from time to time. There may be something that requires payment beyond the retainer that they're operating under. And there may be situations where we want the Collins Center to get involved in grading new position that comes along. So while we don't have anything firm, I wouldn't want to cut it to 0.
No, I'd leave it at 5,000. Just to be
Other
safe.
thought?
We don't use it, it goes back.
It goes
So
back, right?
So the retainer for labor council is covered under special counsel's budget, Mark?
Correct.
Okay, so is there any exclusions in that contract that we'd actually have a bill to Attorney Federoff?
Nothing that would apply to you.
Okay,
So if we were to ask them to do a equal pay analysis like we did prior labor council, we wouldn't have to pay anything extra for that.
I believe that'd be included within the stipend, anything that requires any external work outside of the town. So it's likely if there was a labor case, if there was something that required something defense or work outside of the community, then that would be extra. But something like an equal pay, that's all internal. So I think that would fall within the stipend. So I don't see that there would be an issue.
Okay, I'm going to come up with a lot of ideas for things for labor council.
that's what I'm saying, like, it seems like a good deal, especially if there's very limited exclusions. I get there's other things that may happen on the town level outside of that, but so I don't think 5 is the right number, Barry. I agree with you not going to 0. It would be nice, like, we know there will continue to be evolving positions or new positions every year. So it would be good to get an indicative sense of what that cost would be from a Collins Center. Is that $1,000 a year? Is that $2,000? I don't want to haggle over 1,000 here or there. I say you split the difference at 2,500 is where I'm at. Because I do think we did make a passionate sort of case in prior years of why this number needed to go up, looking ahead to the, I'm gonna get this wrong, quadrennial review, the 4-year review cycle, right? So
which never happens.
I'm not at 0, I'm not at 5. I could live with any number in between those.
Yeah, typically, if we ask them to, we haven't worked with the Collins Center, but in the past, when we ask them to grade something, Vanessa, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's in the hundreds of dollars. It's not thousands.
It is, yeah. I think it would be within, 200 or 300 at the most. If it's all right, I just wanted to comment on 2 other points relative to your FY24 budget.
Go ahead.
Sure. So regarding the tuition reimbursement request, this is something I wanted to pose to the board just to get some feedback on. You don't have to vote on this budget today. By your November meeting, we still have time to turn in the budget before the deadline. But, the chair and I talked about getting feedback from the board today to start that discussion. But on tuition reimbursement, I did have an inquiry yesterday from a department whether they could apply for money from that line item to attend a certificate program. For this particular department, it was the MCPPO program, which is the state procurement division. They run some excellent courses that pertain very closely to the work that particular department would be doing. So although it's not tuition, it's not academic credit, that is something that came up yesterday that I wanted the board to consider. That could come out of a different line item as well. And the other thing I wanted to mention is during the select board's goal setting over the summer, they talked about many, many goals. One of them that was dedicated to Andrew Dennington and Lisa Braccio is doing an employee survey. We've drafted that survey for them to look at this week and hopefully go out, within the next coming days or the next week to 10 days. There's a good portion of questions about employee training. So I think by your November meeting, we'll also have some feedback from a large group of employees about what they're looking for.
Vanessa, does that go to all employees?
It does. So of course, your budget only covers SAP employees. But I will say, whenever we've held a training, we have never told non-SAP employees they can't come. So in effect, we are holding trainings for all employees.
Certification, we should not be paying for with tuition.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling on that is that's employee development,
Yeah.
that's not tuition reimbursement, and I'm not sure what the source of the funds is, but that's employee development to me.
And I'd also say, given the chief procurement officer, the towns in the room, how many people doing, like, I just leave it off to the side, how many PPO certified individuals do we need in town? I know it's a daunting job, but for Lori that's had it, done it before, and Melanie now, and obviously you, but I mean, everything's got to go through you anyway, so I'm not sure which department it is that's asking, but still has to go through you, even if you're not their appointed authority.
That's not tuition.
Yeah, so Vanessa's point that we don't have to make a final decision on any of this today is certainly accurate, but I did want to get a sense of where people were on this, and I'd be comfortable with the 2,500 for consulting. I think that gives us more than we should need, and it's also difficult on employee development when we have no idea what people are going to want for that. Whether we go back to the 3,000 figure.
Yeah, I would just say that employee development is, I think, really important. I don't know how much of the impacts of COVID have sort of shaped how much development you can do. But if the money is going to go back anyway, I don't know that there's harm in sort of giving some funds so that they can proceed with some of the development that they feel they need, especially if they're going to do a survey and perhaps uncover some additional opportunities for development.
Yeah, and again, we've typically had about 3,000 for employee development, and we were requested by the select board because I believe they didn't have it in their budget to add 4,000 to ours to cover some training that they wanted to have done, so we accommodated them. But I've always had an issue that I'm not sure why we have a budget for employee development, because we don't know what employees need. It should be in the individual departments. They should have money to do this, so because they know what training is needed, but be that as it may.
Well, I think it's probably, every organization is different. It could either be in individual departments or more centralized, so that there's some consistency and understanding how we're going to deploy, what's the strategy, how we're going to sort of, execute or implement that, and some level of oversight. I've seen it happen both ways, but I just would recommend that we don't decrease the budget, that we have some opportunity, at least for another year, to assess what do we really think we're going to need for employee development, and then maybe we'll have more data, more opportunity to say, what should this budget be for the next year?
Yeah, I look at it two ways. I think
Sure.
first of all, I 100% agree. In the town's department budgets, right? Each individual department does budget for specific trainings to their employees, if applicable, right? It's a couple thousand here or there, like for my advisory days, like there was some stuff there that you're like, what are they really going to, sort of thing, but I'll leave that off to the side. This, I view this $7,000 is townwide. There are things that apply to all employees, whether you're focusing on department heads or whether you're focusing on just all employees, right? We can rattle off topics that, yeah, should sit in the personnel board, should sit in the select board, should sit in town administrator. we could have all day. I think the thing I like about it being the personnel budget is it allows Mark and Vanessa to bring ideas forward. It allows for some vetting. We usually have employees at this meeting that can also weigh in. I like the idea that we have this survey and stuff like that as well that will inform it. So I view these as group trainings and not department-specific trainings like MCPPO. We're not going to train the whole town on how to be MCPPO sort of thing. So I think it should be in both sides, which is I think where we're trending based on the comments.
Yeah, I think the challenge for us has been getting the ideas for what needs to be done. We have a few times had people who do training come to us and say, I'd like to do training for you, but we need a process, and maybe the survey will be a good vehicle for that, to get ideas so we can sort of take more charge of this than we have historically.
Well, look, Vanessa and Mark are well tied into other communities and what they're doing too. There should be no shame in stealing an idea from another community. Did this training, no one's even brought it forward. Like, we don't have to rely just on our employees. Like, you know, someone else may, like, don't rely on the people bringing you the ideas. Go look at what other people are doing. They're usually very good at publicizing this stuff on social media. Like, let's go just see what others are doing, especially in the local area, and what's resonating with the employees. That's what we should be focused on.
The other two, the office supplies, that's no longer applicable. Vanessa, am I right?
Yes, that was really historically for printing stationery, things like that, that we really do the 98% of that in-house now.
That's a zero.
Yes, that should go to zero. And the dues, Vanessa?
That is still paid out of this budget. It's the Mass Municipal HR Association, the state association that Mark and I belong to. So that's their annual dues.
I'm paying a bill for you and Mark.
It's actually just a point on that. Unlike some of the other state associations, the MMHR covers the entire community. So I often, depending on the monthly meeting topic, will send it to someone in our department or someone else. So many of the other groups, it's based on the person in the job. This one, it's $200 for any town employee or member of the board, certainly, if you'd like to attend one of our monthly meetings.
Anyone have any questions on that? Okay, I'll come back with something for next meeting along the lines of what we discussed that we can formally vote on. Okay, is there any other business?
I guess because I'm new, what are the things that are in other charges and expenses?
That's a sum.
Oh,
It's-
okay.
I was thinking the same
Oh,
thing,
okay.
and then I started doing them. It's a sum. It should be indented, I think.
Thank you. Oh, I see.
Municipal finance
Got it.
software is not the
I got it.
finest.
And then they pull in the others. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Any other business?
Next meeting date?
We're gonna try to get it together earlier.
Well, you're gonna send us
Yeah, I'm
dates once you
gonna
talk
have
to Collins, right?
Yeah. Normally, we'd be looking at the 9th.
Didn't we agree on the following week?
Did we?
I think you set November 17th.
We spent about
Yeah, we
30
did.
minutes
Yeah,
talking about
yeah.
it last meeting.
You're right, we're on the 17th. But we're going to try to schedule a meeting with the Collins Center, hopefully either in 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
Okay, not to throw a wrench, but I'm not here the first week of November,
You never,
and we know where I'm going, so
So just to be clear, is that the week of the 1st or the week of the
Yes.
7th?
1 to 6, I'm gone.
And I'm not available the week of the 7th.
this is why we spent
This
half
is
an
right.
hour.
I can do, but Zoom,
Yeah.
I should be easier.
I can do a Zoom. I'll just bring my computer.
I would propose a Zoom meeting as well.
Okay.
So I think we've given you a lot of availability there.
Yeah,
Do it via
you're,
Zoom.
you're a really flexible group. I appreciate it. Okay. Is there any, let's skip this, is there any public comment? Hearing none. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you all.
Sorry, I had a reader. I was just about to have a meeting.